Craig Harris had always taken pride in the simplicity and solitude of his life. His family's farmland, sprawling over dozens of acres, was more than just property to him, it was his legacy. Passed down from generation to generation, the land carried stories of resilience, love, and perseverance. As a child, he had listened to his grandfather talk about how they had survived the Great Depression by working the soil, and as an adult, Craig found comfort in continuing that tradition. His farm wasn't just a home, it was a living memory of his family's history. For Craig, each patch of soil he tilled was sacred, and each harvest felt like a conversation with those who had worked the land before him. Life on the farm was demanding, but Craig welcomed the routine. The early mornings, the chirping of birds at dawn, the earthy smell of freshly plowed soil, it all grounded him. He didn't need distractions from the outside world. His focus was his work, and he poured every ounce of his energy into keeping the farm productive and healthy. It wasn't just about growing crops, it was about maintaining the integrity of the land. Every inch of his property had a purpose, whether it was for planting, irrigation, or sheltering the native flora and fauna that thrived alongside his agricultural work. One quiet morning, Craig was walking along the edge of his property, inspecting the fences, when something unusual caught his eye. Bright orange flags fluttered in the wind, marking the ground in a grid-like pattern. Craig frowned. These markings hadn't been there yesterday, and he hadn't authorized anyone to enter his land. As he crouched to examine the flags, he noticed stakes driven into the ground with small tags attached. The tags bore technical terms he didn't fully understand but had the unmistakable feel of official paperwork. His unease grew as he spotted fresh tire tracks leading off his property toward the main road. Shaking his head, Craig made a mental note to investigate further later in the day. He assumed it was some kind of mistake, perhaps surveyors who had wandered onto his land by accident. It wouldn't be the first time someone had gotten their directions wrong in this rural area. But as the day progressed, the uneasy feeling in his gut refused to subside. The flags felt like an intrusion, and he didn't like the idea of anyone treating his property as if it were public land. The next day, Craig's concerns deepened when the sound of machinery jolted him awake. Heavy equipment rumbled in the distance, and when he looked out toward the far edge of his property, he saw bulldozers and backhoes tearing into the earth. Workers in hard hats moved with purpose, marking areas and clearing the land as if they owned it. Craig didn't waste a moment. He threw on his boots, grabbed his truck keys, and headed straight for the commotion. When he arrived, a foreman in a neon vest approached him with a clipboard. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone more annoyed than welcoming. Craig gestured toward the machinery. "What the hell is going on here?" "This is my land," he said, his voice firm. The foreman flipped through his clipboard as if searching for a specific page. "We're starting preliminary work on a new project," he replied casually. "You should have received the notification." Craig's heart skipped a beat. "Notification? What notification?" The foreman shrugged. "The Community Improvement Project, an airfield for light aircraft. Didn't you get the letter?" Craig stared at the man, his mind reeling. An airfield? On his property? This couldn't be real. "I never agreed to any airfield," Craig said, his voice rising. The foreman, clearly uninterested in the dispute, held up a hand. "Look, buddy, I just do what I'm told. You've got questions, take it up with the office." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Craig standing in a cloud of dust as the machines continued to tear through his land. That evening, Craig found an envelope taped to his front door. The letter inside was stamped with an official-looking seal and stated that a portion of his land had been designated for temporary use under a community development initiative. The justification was vague, citing increased transportation needs and economic growth for the area. Craig's name wasn't mentioned directly, but the boundaries outlined in the letter unmistakably included his farmland. The letter concluded with a curt note: "All inquiries can be directed to the Regional Development Authority." There was no phone number, only an address. Craig felt anger bubbling beneath his skin. This was more than just an inconvenience, this was an outright violation of his rights. His farm was private property, and no one had the authority to carve out a piece of it without his consent. The more he thought about it, the more infuriated he became. Who were these people to decide what to do with his land? What gave them the right to barge in and disrupt the life he had worked so hard to build? Over the next few days, Craig tried to gather information. He drove to the address listed in the letter, a nondescript office building in the nearby town. The receptionist barely glanced up as he explained his situation. "You'll need to fill out a formal request for review," she said, handing him a stack of papers. Processing time is about 6 to 8 weeks. Craig's frustration grew as he realized the system was designed to delay and deflect. No one was willing to take responsibility or provide clear answers. The workers on his land continued their project unabated, seemingly indifferent to his objections. Craig's neighbors weren't much help either. When he mentioned the situation to a few of them, they seemed reluctant to get involved. One older farmer shrugged and said, "They did something similar to my brother's land a few years back. Fought it for months, but in the end, they won. Best to just let it go," but Craig couldn't let it go. This wasn't just about land, it was about his principles, his family's legacy, and his right to protect what was his. One evening, Craig stood at the edge of his property, staring at the destruction the workers had caused. Piles of dirt and uprooted plants dotted the landscape where his crops used to grow. In the fading light, the orange flags and machinery looked almost surreal, like something out of a bad dream. But this was no dream. It was his reality, and he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them take his land without a fight. The following morning, Craig woke to the sound of engines again. The rumble of heavy machinery reverberated across his fields, louder and closer than the day before. He hadn't slept well, his thoughts consumed by the events of the prior day. The sight of his land being torn apart was burned into his mind, and the letter taped to his door had only deepened his frustration. Tossing on a flannel shirt and boots, he grabbed his keys and headed out to confront the situation head-on. He wasn't going to let them ruin his farm without at least hearing an explanation. As he drove down the dirt road toward the construction site, Craig's stomach churned at the sight before him. A significant portion of his property had been fenced off overnight. Metal barriers lined the perimeter, bearing laminated signs that read "Authorized personnel only." Beyond the barriers, workers in hard hats and vests operated bulldozers and excavators, tearing into the earth as if they owned it. What was once a peaceful expanse of fertile farmland now resembled a war zone. Craig parked his truck near the edge of the fence, his tires skidding to a halt on loose gravel. He got out and approached the gate, where a security guard stood blocking the entrance. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge here," Craig demanded, his voice firm but controlled. The guard didn't flinch. He was a tall man with a shaved head, arms crossed over his chest, and an expression that exuded indifference. "Sorry, sir. This is a restricted area," the guard replied. Craig's jaw tightened. "This is my land. I have a right to know what's going on," the guard shrugged, unmoved. "You'll have to take that up with the project manager. I'm just here to keep people out." Craig's temper flared, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't going to let them provoke him into making a mistake. "Fine. Get the project manager." "I'll wait," he said, stepping back from the gate but refusing to leave. The guard sighed and muttered something into a radio clipped to his shoulder. A few minutes later, a woman in a sharp navy blue suit emerged from one of the temporary trailers set up on the site. She walked toward the gate with a clipboard in hand and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harris, I presume," she said, her tone saccharine and overly polite. Craig nodded. "That's right. And you are the woman." Extended a hand, which Craig pointedly ignored. "I'm Victoria Blake, the project coordinator. I understand you have some concerns about the work we're doing here." Her words were calm, rehearsed, as though she had given this speech a dozen times before. Craig didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I want to know why you're on my property without my permission," he said bluntly. Victoria's smile didn't waver. "Mr. Harris, this project is part of a larger community development initiative aimed at improving transportation infrastructure in the area. The addition of a small airfield will provide significant economic benefits, not just for you, but for all the residents in the region. I assure you. This is being done with the best interests of the community in mind." Craig's fists clenched at his sides. "That's all well and good, but this is my land. I didn't agree to any of this, and I don't plan to." Victoria tilted her head slightly, as if she were speaking to a stubborn child. I understand your frustration, but the land you're referring to has been temporarily allocated for public use under eminent domain. I believe you received the official notice. Craig's heart pounded in his chest. Eminent domain? That couldn't be right. I never received anything until yesterday, and even that letter didn't mention eminent domain. He shot back. It just said my land was being used for some community project. I haven't signed anything. I haven't even been consulted. Victoria's smile finally faltered, just for a moment. She glanced at her clipboard, flipping through a few pages before looking back at Craig. The notice would have been sent to the address on file with the county. If there was a delay in delivery, I do apologize, but the process is already underway. At this stage, there's little room for negotiation. Craig took a step closer to the gate, his voice rising. This is my property. My family has worked this land for generations. You can't just show up and start bulldozing it like you own the place. Victoria's tone turned colder, more clinical. Mr. Harris, I assure you we are fully within our legal rights. If you have further concerns, I suggest you consult with an attorney with that. She turned on her heel and walked back toward the trailer, leaving Craig seething at the gate. The security guard gave him a pointed look, as if daring him to cause trouble. Craig drove home, his mind racing. The words eminent domain echoed in his head, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. He had heard of eminent domain being used for highways or utilities, but an airfield? On private farmland? It didn't add up. The letter he'd received hadn't mentioned eminent domain either, and the vague wording about temporary use felt more like a loophole than a legitimate claim. Determined to get answers, Craig called the county office as soon as he got home. After being transferred through a maze of departments, he finally reached someone in the zoning division. The woman on the other end of the line sounded tired and overworked. Mr. Harris, the project you're referring to was approved 6 months ago. Notices were sent to all affected property owners at that time, she explained. Craig gritted his teeth. I didn't get any notice. This is the first I'm hearing about it. How can they approve something like this without my consent? The woman hesitated before replying. If the project is deemed to serve the public good, consent from individual property owners isn't always required. You should have the option to contest the decision, but that process would need to be initiated through a formal hearing. Craig hung up the phone, his frustration mounting. A formal hearing? That could take months, if not longer. Meanwhile, the construction on his land showed no signs of slowing down. He couldn't afford to wait for bureaucracy to catch up. He needed to act now. That evening, Craig decided to take a closer look at the construction site under cover of darkness. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he parked his truck a short distance away and made his way on foot. The site was quiet now, the workers gone for the day, but the machinery and trailers remained. As he approached the perimeter, he noticed something strange. Several large holes had been dug in the ground, far larger than what would be needed for basic foundations. He crouched near one of the holes and shone his flashlight inside. The walls of the pit were lined with something metallic, almost like a casing. What could they possibly need that for in a small airfield? Before he could investigate further, Craig heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel behind him. He whipped around, his flashlight catching the figure of a man standing just a few feet away. The man was dressed in a dark jacket, his face obscured by shadows. "You shouldn't be here," the man said flatly. Craig's grip tightened on the flashlight. "This is my land. I'll go where I damn well please," he shot back. The man didn't move. "You're making things harder for yourself. Go home." Craig stood his ground, but before he could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Shaken, Craig retreated to his truck and drove home, his mind racing. Something was deeply wrong about this project, and he had a sinking feeling that it went far beyond a simple airfield. Whatever was happening on his land, it was clear that the people behind it would stop at nothing to push it forward. Craig woke up the next morning with a sense of urgency gnawing at him. The encounter with the man at the construction site the night before hadn't just unsettled him, it had confirmed his growing suspicion that this wasn't just about building a simple airfield. There was something bigger at play, and whatever it was, the people behind it were determined to keep him in the dark. He spent the early hours poring over the letter he'd received and his family's land records, hoping to find some clue or loophole that would help him fight back. But the more he searched, the more questions he found. Why hadn't he been properly notified? Why had his property been singled out? And why was the construction so secretive? Mid-morning, Craig decided it was time to take more decisive action. He called his lawyer, Amanda Prescott, a sharp and experienced attorney who had helped him with property disputes in the past. When he explained the situation, her reaction was immediate. "Craig, this doesn't sound right at all. Eminent domain is a powerful tool, but it's heavily regulated. They can't just take your land without clear justification. And a private airfield doesn't exactly scream public good. I'll start digging into the approval process and see what I can uncover. In the meantime, don't sign anything and document everything that happens on your property." Feeling slightly reassured, Craig spent the rest of the day following Amanda's advice. He walked the perimeter of his farm, taking photos and videos of the construction site, the machinery, and the barriers that now cut off a large portion of his land. He also made sure to document the damage to his crops and irrigation system, evidence of the destruction the construction had already caused. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every so often, he would glance toward the construction site and see workers or security guards looking in his direction, their expressions unreadable. That evening, Amanda called back with news. "Craig, I found some preliminary information, and it's not good. The project was fast-tracked through the county zoning board under the guise of economic development. There's a lot of vague language in the documents. But it looks like the developers claimed the airfield would serve as a hub for emergency medical flights and small-scale cargo transportation. Those are the kinds of things that can justify eminent domain, even if they're only loosely true." Craig's stomach sank. "But it's all lies," he said. "There's no way this is about medical flights. The size of the construction alone doesn't make sense for something like that." Amanda sighed. "I agree, but proving that is going to be tricky. These developers are counting on people like you not having the resources to fight them. I'm going to request a copy of the zoning board's decision and the environmental impact report. If there's anything fishy in there, we'll find it." The next few days brought little relief. Amanda's investigation would take time, but the construction on Craig's land showed no signs of slowing down. In fact, it seemed to be accelerating. More machinery arrived, and the workers began setting up massive concrete forms that looked far too substantial for a small airfield. Meanwhile, Craig started receiving letters from the construction company's legal team. The tone of the letters was aggressive, accusing him of interfering with the project and warning of potential legal action if he continued to contest their work. One letter even demanded that he remove the cameras he had installed, claiming they violated the privacy of the workers on the site. The tipping point came when Craig discovered that his irrigation system had been completely disabled. He had gone out early in the morning to check on his crops, only to find the water supply cut off. When he followed the lines to the source, he discovered that the construction crew had dug up the main pipes and severed them without any attempt to repair or reroute the system. Furious, Craig marched straight to the gate and demanded to speak to Victoria Blake. After a tense wait, she emerged from her trailer, her expression as composed as ever. "Ms. Blake," Craig began, barely able to contain his anger. "Your crew has destroyed my irrigation system. My crops are dying because of this. I want it fixed immediately." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her tone calm and patronizing. "Mr. Harris, I understand your frustration, but our work is in full compliance with the zoning board's directives. Any disruptions to your operations are regrettable but unavoidable during a project of this scale. I suggest you speak with the county if you have concerns about compensation." Craig clenched his fists, his voice rising. "This isn't just a disruption, it's sabotage. You've rendered a huge part of my farm unusable, and you're acting like it's no big deal." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "As I said, Mr. Harris, you're welcome to take up your concerns with the appropriate authorities. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to oversee." Craig left the site seething, but he wasn't about to back down. He spent the next few hours repairing what he could of the irrigation system, though the damage was extensive. By the time he finished, he was exhausted and covered in mud, but his determination had only grown stronger. He knew he was up against a powerful and well-funded opponent, but he wasn't going to let them destroy his land without a fight. That night, as Craig reviewed the footage from his cameras, he noticed something strange. In the middle of the night, several workers had returned to the site and appeared to be inspecting one of the large concrete pits. They moved quickly and deliberately, as if they didn't want to be seen. Craig couldn't make out much detail in the grainy footage, but the sight of people sneaking around after hours only deepened his suspicions. What were they hiding? The next morning, Amanda called with another update. "Craig, I found something interesting. The environmental impact report for the project is full of inconsistencies. For one thing, there's no mention of the potential effects on your farm's water supply, which should have been a major consideration. And get this, the report was prepared by a consulting firm that has direct financial ties to the development company. It's a clear conflict of interest." Craig felt a glimmer of hope. "Can we use that to stop them?" he asked. Amanda hesitated. "It's a start, but we'll need more evidence. If we can prove that the developers knowingly misrepresented the project's scope or violated environmental regulations, we'll have a much stronger case." Craig decided to take Amanda's advice and focus on gathering more evidence. He spent the day documenting every detail of the construction site, from the machinery and materials being used to the damage done to his land. He also reached out to his neighbors, hoping to find others who might be willing to stand with him. To his surprise, a few of them admitted that they had received similar letters about the project but had chosen not to contest it. "I didn't think there was anything I could do," one neighbor said. "They've got all the money and lawyers. What chance do we have?" Craig's frustration grew as he realized how many people had been intimidated into silence. But he refused to give up. That night, as he stood on the edge of his property, staring at the bright lights of the construction site, he made a vow to himself. He didn't know what the developers were hiding or why they were so determined to push this project through, but he was going to find out, and when he did, he would make sure they regretted ever setting foot on his land. Craig stood at the edge of his property, the glow of construction lights spilling over the once darkened fields, casting long shadows across the barren patches of earth. His farm was no longer a sanctuary, it felt like a battleground. Every sound of machinery drilling into the ground, every distant voice shouting commands, made his frustration simmer. The past week had been a relentless cycle of challenges, legal threats, sabotage, and an ever-expanding construction site encroaching on land his family had worked for generations. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed leverage. Amanda had been working tirelessly, digging through zoning approvals and environmental reports, and while the inconsistencies she found were helpful, Craig knew they weren't enough to stop the project outright. The developers weren't just playing dirty, they had insulated themselves with layers of bureaucracy and legal loopholes, making it nearly impossible to pin anything on them. And yet, there was something deeply wrong about the way they operated. The late-night activity at the site, the mysterious concrete pits, and the evasive behavior of the project's leadership all pointed to a hidden agenda. Craig's instincts told him this wasn't just about a small airfield, it was something bigger, something they didn't want him to uncover. The breaking point came when Amanda called that afternoon. Her voice was tense, edged with urgency. "Craig, I just got to look at the permits for the airfield," she said. "Something about this doesn't add up. The scope of the project described in the documents is much smaller than what's actually being built. They're authorized for a single runway and a small hangar, but from what you've told me, they're clearing way more land than that. Either they've expanded the project without updating the permits, or they're deliberately misrepresenting what they're doing. Either way, it's illegal." Craig gripped the phone tighter. "So what do we do with this?" he asked, pacing the length of his kitchen. "Can we file an injunction or something to stop them?" Amanda sighed. "Not yet. We need concrete proof, something that shows they're violating the terms of their permits. If we go to court with just suspicions, they'll bury us in legal fees and counterclaims. But if we can prove they're breaking the law, we'll have a real case." Craig hung up the phone feeling a mix of determination and dread. If Amanda was right, the developers were already cutting corners, but exposing their lies wouldn't be easy. He decided to take another look at the site that night, this time with a more focused approach. If there was evidence to be found, he was going to find it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Craig grabbed his flashlight and a set of binoculars, then made his way toward the construction zone. He stayed low, moving along the tree line to avoid being seen. The workers had packed up for the day, but the lights remained on, illuminating the skeletal frames of partially constructed buildings and the wide, empty pits that dotted the site. Craig crouched behind a row of bushes, scanning the area with his binoculars. At first, everything seemed normal, just a standard construction site. But then he noticed something strange. Near one of the larger pits, a group of men in plain clothes was gathered, speaking in hushed tones. They weren't wearing hard hats or construction vests, and their posture was tense, as if they were discussing something they didn't want overheard. Craig focused his binoculars on the group, trying to make out their conversation, but he was too far away to hear anything clearly. He shifted his attention to the pit itself. Large, industrial-looking crates had been lowered into the ground, their sides stamped with markings he didn't recognize. Some of the men were gesturing toward the crates, while others appeared to be taking measurements or writing notes. Whatever they were doing, it didn't look like standard airfield construction. Suddenly, the men dispersed, and a forklift appeared, carrying another crate toward the pit. Craig took out his phone, snapping a series of photos from his hiding spot. He didn't know what the crates contained, but the secrecy surrounding them was enough to raise alarms. As the forklift lowered the crate into the pit, Craig noticed something else, a faint, greenish glow emanating from the gaps in the crate's panels. His stomach turned. Whatever was inside wasn't normal. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted Craig from his thoughts. He quickly ducked lower into the bushes, holding his breath as two security guards walked past, their flashlights scanning the area. "You think they know?" one of them asked, his voice low but audible. "Harris is nosy, but he doesn't have a clue," the other replied. "Blake said to keep an eye on him, though. She thinks he's too close for comfort." Craig stayed frozen until the guards moved out of earshot. His mind raced. Blake knew he was a threat, which meant he was on the right track. But it also meant he was running out of time. He needed to act fast before they could shut him out completely. The next morning, Craig met with Amanda to review the photos he had taken. Her reaction was immediate. "This isn't normal," she said, pointing to the glowing crate. "Whatever's in there, it's not related to building an airfield. This could be a violation of environmental laws or worse." Craig nodded. "I thought the same thing. They're hiding something, Amanda, and I'm willing to bet it's the reason they pushed this project through so quickly." Amanda leaned back in her chair, thinking. "We need to escalate this," she said. "I'm going to reach out to a few environmental watchdog groups and see if they can help. If we can get an independent investigation started, we might be able to shut this down before it's too late. In the meantime, you need to stay vigilant. They're watching you, Craig. And if they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to come after you." That evening, Craig decided to take additional precautions. He installed more cameras around his property, focusing on the areas closest to the construction site. He also backed up the photos and videos he had taken, storing copies in multiple locations in case anything happened to his equipment. As much as he hated to admit it, Amanda was right. He was being watched, and the developers weren't above using intimidation to silence him. A few nights later, Craig's suspicions were confirmed. He was awoken in the middle of the night by the sound of an engine idling near his driveway. Peering out the window, he saw a black SUV parked just beyond the property line. The headlights were off, but he could see the faint glow of a phone screen inside the vehicle. Craig grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, his pulse quickening. As he approached the SUV, it sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust as it disappeared down the road. Craig stood there for a moment, his heart pounding. Whoever was in that car wasn't just passing through, they were watching him. The next day, Amanda called with an update. "I've reached out to an environmental group that specializes in cases like this," she said. "They're interested in the photos you took and want to send a team to investigate. If they find anything illegal, it could blow this whole project wide open." Craig felt a surge of hope. Finally, he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But as he hung up the phone, he couldn't shake the feeling that the developers wouldn't go down without a fight. They had too much at stake, and they had already shown They were willing to bend the rules to get what they wanted. Craig knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but he was more determined than ever to protect his land and uncover the truth. Whatever secrets were buried in those pits, he was going to make sure they saw the light of day. Craig's world had transformed into a high-stakes standoff. What had started as a construction project encroaching on his land had escalated into something far darker and more insidious. The late-night surveillance, the mysterious glowing crates, and the growing hostility from the developers were signs that this wasn't just about an airfield. As Craig prepared for the next phase of his fight, he felt the weight of the battle pressing down on him. The developers were powerful, organized, and relentless, and he had no illusions that they would play fair. But Craig had no intention of backing down. Early one morning, as Craig worked in his barn repairing tools damaged during the recent construction chaos, his phone buzzed. Amanda's name flashed on the screen, and he answered quickly. "Craig, we've got a problem," she said, her voice sharp and direct. "I've just been served notice that the developers are suing you for obstruction of operations and damages. They're claiming your interference has cost them thousands in delays." Craig's grip on the phone tightened. "Damages? They're the ones tearing up my land and sabotaging my irrigation." "This is insane," Amanda sighed. "It's a scare tactic, but we can't ignore it. They're trying to wear you down with legal pressure. I'll file a response, but this could drag on for months." The lawsuit was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Craig noticed a marked shift in the developers' tactics. Trucks began arriving at the construction site in the dead of night, their headlights off and engines rumbling quietly as they delivered materials. Workers who had previously ignored Craig's presence now shot him cold, calculating looks whenever he came near. Even the security guards seemed more aggressive, patrolling closer to his property line and occasionally lingering near his cameras as if to intimidate him. It was clear they wanted to send a message this was their land now, and Craig was nothing more than an obstacle. One evening, Craig was walking the perimeter of his property when he noticed something that made his blood boil. A section of his southern fence had been cut, the posts lying splintered on the ground. On the other side, Bulldozer had flattened part of his field, leaving deep scars in the soil where crops should have been growing. He stormed toward the construction site, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, and demanded to speak with Victoria Blake. After a long wait, she emerged from one of the trailers, her expression cool and composed as always. "Victoria," Craig said, his voice laced with barely restrained fury, "your crew has destroyed another part of my property. My fence is down, my field is torn up, and my crops are gone. This isn't just negligence anymore, it's deliberate sabotage." Victoria's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Harris, as I've explained before, construction projects of this magnitude can sometimes lead to unforeseen complications. If you believe there's been damage to your property, you're welcome to file a formal complaint with our office." Her tone was infuriatingly dismissive, as though she were speaking to a child throwing a tantrum. "A formal complaint," Craig snapped. "Your people are trespassing on my land and destroying everything I've built, and you expect me to just fill out some paperwork." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "We're well within our legal rights, Mr. Harris. If you continue to obstruct our work, you'll leave us no choice but to escalate the matter further." Craig stared at her, his fists clenched at his sides. He could feel the rage bubbling inside him, but he knew losing his temper wouldn't help. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck, the weight of her veiled threat hanging heavy over him. They weren't just trying to intimidate him, they were daring him to make a mistake they could use against him. The next morning, Craig received another blow. A letter arrived in his mailbox from the local zoning office, stating that his farm was under review for compliance with regional development standards. The letter claimed that his equipment, fencing, and irrigation systems might be in violation of new zoning regulations tied to the airfield project. Craig felt his stomach drop as he read the words. This was no coincidence. The developers were weaponizing the system against him, using bureaucratic red tape to tie his hands and distract him from fighting back. Desperate for help, Craig called Amanda and told her about the latest letter. "They're throwing everything they've got at me," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I can't keep up with this on my own." Amanda's tone was steady, but Craig could hear the tension behind her words. They're trying to break you, Craig. They want you overwhelmed and out of options. But we're not going to let that happen. I'm filing an appeal on the zoning review, and I'll reach out to some contacts who might be able to push back on this. She paused for a moment before adding, and Craig, be careful. These people play dirty. If they think they can scare you into giving up, they'll escalate. That night, Craig decided to take further precautions. He reinforced the remaining sections of his fence using heavy-duty materials that would be harder to cut or damage. He also added additional cameras along the southern boundary of his property, hoping to catch any trespassers in the act. As he worked under the cover of darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every rustle of leaves or distant sound of machinery made his nerves jangle, but he forced himself to keep going. If the developers wanted to intimidate him, they were going to have to try a lot harder. A few days later, Amanda called with news that gave Craig a glimmer of hope. I've been in touch with the environmental watchdog group, she said. They've reviewed your photos and videos, and they're very concerned about what's happening at the site. They believe there could be violations of both state and federal environmental laws, especially with those crates you mentioned. They're sending a team to investigate. And if they find anything illegal, we'll have grounds to file a formal complaint with the EPA. Craig felt a surge of relief. For the first time in weeks, it felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the developers weren't finished yet. That same evening, Craig discovered that someone had tampered with his irrigation system again. The pipes he had painstakingly repaired had been ripped apart, the damage far more extensive than before. Furious, he reviewed the footage from his cameras and found exactly what he was looking for: two men in dark clothing sneaking onto his property in the middle of the night, their faces obscured by masks. They worked quickly and efficiently, destroying the pipes before slipping back toward the construction site. Craig sent the footage to Amanda immediately, and she promised to escalate the matter with local law enforcement. But Craig wasn't optimistic. The developers had connections, and so far, the authorities had shown little interest in taking his side. He couldn't afford to wait for them to act. He had to take matters into his own hands. The next day, Craig confronted the foreman at the construction site, holding printed stills from the security footage. Your people are trespassing on my land and destroying my property, he said, his voice cold and controlled. I have video evidence, and I'm not afraid to use it. The foreman glanced at the photos, his expression unreadable. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his tone flat. If you have a problem, take it up with management. Craig's jaw tightened, but he held his ground. This isn't going away. You think you can bully me into giving up, but you're wrong. I'll fight this until my last breath if I have to. As Craig walked away, he noticed the foreman speaking into a radio, his gaze following Craig's every move. The message was clear: the developers weren't backing down, but neither was Craig. He didn't know how long the fight would last or what it would cost him, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let them win. The air was heavy with tension as Craig stood at the edge of his property, staring out at the chaos that had overtaken his land. The construction site was a flurry of activity, even in the early hours of the morning. Workers moved with an urgency that hadn't been there before, cranes lifting massive steel beams into place while bulldozers carved deeper into the earth. The sense of secrecy surrounding the project had only grown, and Craig knew that whatever was happening here was about to reach a boiling point. He had spent weeks documenting every detail, working with Amanda and the environmental watchdog group, but the developers were escalating faster than he could react. Amanda's most recent call had only added fuel to the fire. Craig, we've got confirmation, she had said, her voice firm but urgent. The environmental team found something. Those crates on the site? They're filled with industrial waste, highly toxic materials, and the site itself. It's directly above an aquifer that supplies water to most of the surrounding area. If those chemicals leak, it could contaminate the water supply for miles. This isn't just a violation, it's criminal. We need to act now. Craig had felt both relief and dread at her words. They finally had the evidence they needed to stop the project, but exposing it wouldn't be easy. The developers were already showing signs that they were aware of the growing scrutiny. Security at the site had doubled, and Craig had noticed unmarked cars idling near his property more frequently, their drivers clearly keeping an eye on him. It was clear they were preparing for a fight, and Craig had no choice but to meet them head-on. That evening, as Craig prepared to send the latest batch of photos and videos to Amanda, he heard the sound of vehicles approaching. He stepped onto his porch just in time to see a convoy of trucks pulling onto the construction site, their headlights cutting through the darkness. What caught his attention, though, was the presence of several black SUVs with tinted windows, their doors opening to reveal men in suits. These weren't construction workers, they were corporate representatives, here to oversee something important. Craig's stomach twisted with unease. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. He grabbed his binoculars and watched as the men gathered near one of the larger pits. They were speaking in hushed tones, their gestures sharp and deliberate. Craig noticed that one of the crates had been hoisted out of the pit and placed on a flatbed truck. The glow emanating from its seams was faint but unmistakable. He snapped a series of photos, his heart racing. If they were moving the crates, it meant they were trying to cover their tracks. Craig didn't have time to wait for Amanda's advice. He grabbed his truck keys and headed toward the site, determined to confront them directly. As he approached the gate, a pair of security guards stepped forward to block his path. "Turn around, Harris," one of them said, his tone laced with warning. Craig didn't flinch. "Get Blake out here," he demanded. Now the guards exchanged a glance before one of them spoke into his radio. A few tense minutes later, Victoria Blake emerged from one of the trailers, her expression colder than usual. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice clipped. "What can I do for you this time?" Craig held up his phone, displaying the photos of the glowing crates. "You can start by explaining what the hell is in those crates and why you're trying to move them in the middle of the night." Victoria's eyes flickered with something Craig couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Annoyance? "I don't know what you think you found," she said evenly, "but you're trespassing on an active construction site. I suggest you leave before you cause yourself any more trouble." Craig stepped closer, his voice rising. "This isn't about construction, and we both know it. Those crates are full of toxic waste, and you're sitting on an aquifer. If even a fraction of that leaks into the water supply, it'll poison half the county. You think you can bury this, but I won't let you." Victoria's composure cracked, just for a moment. "You're making a mistake, Harris," she said, her tone sharp. "You don't understand what's at stake here." Before Craig could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the night. Red and blue lights lit up the site as a convoy of police cars and unmarked vehicles pulled in. Craig turned to see Amanda stepping out of one of the cars, flanked by two members of the environmental watchdog team. "Craig," she called out, her voice steady. "We've got the injunction. They're shutting it down." The site erupted into chaos. Workers scrambled to shut off equipment, while the corporate representatives argued with the arriving authorities. Victoria's face was a mask of fury as she marched toward one of the officers, gesturing wildly. "You can't do this," she shouted. "We have permits, and everything is by the book." The officer, unfazed, held up a clipboard. "We've received credible evidence of environmental violations and public safety risks. This site is now under investigation. Step aside, ma'am." Craig watched as the officers moved to secure the area, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and vindication. The developer's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and their secrets were finally being dragged into the light. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The people behind this project were too powerful, too well connected to go down quietly. Still, for the first time in weeks, Craig felt like he had the upper hand. As the last of the trucks were escorted off the site and the glow of the crates faded into the distance, Craig stood alone at the edge of his property. The air was still, the hum of machinery replaced by the quiet sounds of the night. His farm was scarred, his fields torn apart, but his resolve remained unbroken. This land was his, and no amount of intimidation or corporate greed was going to change that. The construction site was silent now, its machinery idle, and its workers gone. The barricades and trailers that had once loomed over Craig's farm had been dismantled, leaving only scarred earth and empty pits as evidence of the battle that had raged here. The injunction Amanda had secured had done its job, halting the project and forcing the developers to vacate the property while the investigation into their activities unfolded. For the first time in weeks, Craig could stand on his land and feel a semblance of peace, but the damage left behind was a stark reminder that the fight wasn't over. Over the next few days, Craig worked tirelessly to assess the full extent of the destruction. His irrigation system was in shambles, his crops were ruined, and vast sections of his fields had been torn apart by bulldozers and heavy machinery. The land that had once been a testament to his family's resilience was now a battleground in every sense of the word. But Craig was determined to rebuild, no matter how long it took. This farm was his legacy, and he wasn't about to let the scars left by the developers define it. Amanda kept him updated as the legal and environmental cases against the developers progressed. The environmental watchdog group had uncovered a trove of evidence, including falsified permits, concealed hazardous materials, and blatant violations of state and federal regulations. The crates Craig had documented contained toxic waste, much of it improperly stored and transported, and the pits dug on his property were intended to bury the evidence before anyone could discover it. The aquifer beneath the site, a critical source of water for the region, had narrowly avoided contamination thanks to Craig's persistence and the timely intervention of the environmental team. The developers, now facing multiple lawsuits and public outrage, attempted to shift blame onto their subcontractors and consultants, but the mounting evidence against them made their defenses weak. Amanda assured Craig that a significant settlement was likely, one that would not only compensate him for the damage done to his farm but also fund its restoration. "They tried to destroy you, Craig," she said during one of their calls, "but you exposed them for what they are. This is a victory not just for you but for everyone they've hurt." As word of Craig's struggle spread, he found himself at the center of an unexpected movement. Neighbors who had initially stayed silent began reaching out, sharing their own stories of intimidation and coercion by developers and corporate interests. Many of them credited Craig's tenacity for giving them the courage to stand up for their own rights. Local farmers banded together, forming a coalition dedicated to protecting their land from similar threats in the future. Craig was reluctant to take on a leadership role, but his actions had inspired others, and they looked to him for guidance. On a crisp morning weeks later, Craig stood at the edge of his property, watching as a team of contractors began the work of restoring his fields. The settlement funds had come through faster than expected, thanks to Amanda's skillful negotiation, and he was finally able to start rebuilding. New irrigation lines were being installed, damaged fences were being replaced, and the torn soil was being prepared for fresh planting. It would take time for the farm to fully recover, but Craig was patient. He had fought too hard to give up now. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm light over the farm, Craig felt a sense of closure settling over him. The developers had been defeated, their lies and corruption laid bare for the world to see. His land, though scarred, remained his, and he had proven that even against powerful forces, resilience and determination could prevail. This farm had withstood the test of time, and now it had withstood this battle as well. Craig took a deep breath, the scent of freshly turned earth filling his lungs. The scars on his land would heal, just as the scars from this fight would. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph, standing on the soil that he and his family had fought so hard to protect. This was his home, and no one, not developers, not corporations, not anyone would ever take it from him.